My name is Paul Leclerc. It's my very great honor to be the director of this place, this great Columbia Global Center here in Paris. And on behalf of all of the staff of the Global Center, to welcome you to a really important conversation between two very distinguished authors and experts on a vitally important part of our world, the Arab world of North Africa, and more specifically, those nations that were subjected to French colonization. The first of these authors is Safwan Masri, my colleague and my very, very good friend at Columbia University, where he is the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. We are sitting tonight in one of Columbia University's 9 global centers, a vitally important network that spans the world and that has brought the university's faculty, students, and professional expertise to Beijing, Mumbai, Amman, Tunis, Nairobi, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago, Chile, and Paris, and the regions that those capital cities or other large cities encompass. The very fact that this network exists is due almost entirely to the dynamism, the entrepreneurship, the diplomatic skills, and the pure endurance of Professor Masri. He spends much of his life aloft and in a dizzying array of time zones. Nonetheless, he has somehow managed to find the time, I don't know how he did it, in which to write an enormously important new book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, published this fall by Columbia University Press and available for purchase at the end of our program tonight. Professor Masri will be joined in this conversation with another very distinguished author, the cultural historian, biographer, and journalist Andrew Hussey, and the former dean of the University of London program here in Paris. Professor Hussey is the author of 5 important books, the most recent of which is The French Intifada, The Long War Between France and Its Arabs. He is also a highly respected television personality, having created 3 BBC television programs, 2 on French culture, French cuisine, and a 3rd on the Louvre. He's presently based here in Paris, where he is the professor of cultural history at the University of London's School of Advanced Study. Please give Professors Masri and Hussey a very, very warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll just sort of kick off by saying a couple of things. First of all, I'm pleased and honoured to be introducing Safwan here today for one big reason, that this book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, which I think you all should read straight away, is a thoroughly excellent piece of work. But more than this, it's both timely and provocative. And I think, one of the reasons that I'm really pleased to be invited here tonight to talk about Tunisia is that in many senses, although Tunisia is the country that triggered what we call the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolution, you may or may not be right to use those terms, it's in many ways still politically, culturally, historically, although ever present in our world, it's still very much uncharted territory. And Professor Masri is literally, in every sense, a pioneer in making the maps of the past, present, and possibly the future of Tunisia. So that's the big reason why I'm very pleased to be here tonight. Secondly, I've got a personal vested interest in this. Not that I bought shares in the book or anything like that, but I was part, in a very small way, of its genesis. This was when, in 2015, the spring of 2015, I met Professor Masri for the first time here in Paris. And there were 2 reasons why the timing of this meeting was so important. 2015 was a terrible year in France and North Africa. The spring of 2015, in every sense, and I'm not over-dramatising, we all know what that year was like, we were caught between massacres. Massacres that we did not yet understand and which had massive historic implications. Now, I remember that we talked about my work, the French Intifada, but the focus of our conversation for both of us was Tunisia. And I think since then, Tunisia has actually become even more important than how we perceived it to be and where we thought it was going to go. We're now beyond 2015, and I think, without exaggerating too much, we're in a new historical era. So Professor Masri's book is the beginning of mapping out that era. So I'm just going to briefly ask Professor Masri to introduce the book before I go into some questions. But my starting point really is that this is very much a book that speaks to us right now.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really just a wonderful and much appreciated enthusiastic introduction to the book, and thank you, Paul. Paul has been an incredible friend and colleague, and welcome to all of you to the Columbia Global Center here in Paris. It's really very poignant for me to be here in my capacity usually as the EVP for Global Centers, but to be here as the author of this book. So just by way of introduction, and it's interesting that you refer back to our launch back in the spring of 2015, because I was really very interested in your work and in what I had been reading and trying to understand the dynamics in France between between its Arab inhabitants, North African, and French society, the French state, and we got on to talk about the work that I was starting to do on Tunisia. To me, this book has really been a very personal journey. I grew up in Jordan, and I did my studies in the United States. I spent my entire career in the United States, but over the past decade, I've spent more and more time in the Arab world, setting up educational institutions, including the Columbia Global Center in Amman, Jordan. And I was there when the Arab Spring happened. And the reason that the book is very personal is that, one, I had been a student and an observer of developments in the Arab world. And the Arab world I went back to at least live part of my time in the middle 2000s was a very, very different Arab world than the one that I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s. I mean, almost unrecognizable in terms of how society had evolved, in terms of how hegemonic the role of religion had become, in terms of where the education systems had been and are today, and how all of these things intersected. And then when the Arab Spring happened, there was a little bit of hope, but as we all know, that hope turned to despair in a number of countries of the Arab world, Syria, Yemen, Libya in particular. Yet Tunisia, where the Arab Spring started with the self-revelation of Mohammed Bouazizi on December 17, 2010, shocked the world in that it was able to actually move forward with its democratic process. In Egypt, we had hope, Tahrir Square, the ouster of Mubarak, elections. 2 years later, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood was already making some dents in Egypt, and then, of course, we had the military coup. So I became interested in the reasons why Tunisia was able to get the revolution started. Within the first year of the revolution, we had elections for a constituent assembly. Moreover, we had three parties that are quite disparate from one another, one of them being an Islamist party, come together and form a coalition to run the country, a Troika coalition. And then 2013, on the heels of two political assassinations, when we all expected things to crumble down and fall apart, four civil society organizations came together and literally saved the day. And they were recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee 2 years later in 2015. For the first time in an Arab Muslim country, an Islamist party, Al-Nahda, withdrew from power. 2014, we saw elections for parliament, we saw elections for a president, and we see a process that continues to consolidate with threats. I mean, definitely, and we hopefully will have a chance today, Andrew, to talk about some of the factors that make the democratic transition in Tunisia fragile. The reason it became very personal to me, and on that point I finished the introduction, is because in Tunis and in my many visits since the Arab Spring, I saw what I did not see anywhere else in the Arab world, but what I had seen in the Arab world growing up in the 1960s and 70s. It made me very nostalgic for Amman and in Beirut and in Cairo, and the potential that those cities and those countries held, the countries of my childhood, and to see that that world has left us in those countries, but it still is very much there in Tunisia. And I became really driven by a quest to understand what is it about Tunisia, and what is it about its history, and what is it about its ability, and what are the factors that have allowed for this to happen in Tunisia, and that's what the book discusses.
I love the fact that you started off talking about nostalgia, because far from politics or history, that was going to be my first question.
Good.
And I like the idea that nostalgia, it's a Mediterranean term, isn't it? It's Greek. It's the aching for a long lost home. And I think we're going somewhere if we talk about the physicality of Tunis. Now, I love in the opening section, I'm going to read this to you, and then ask what this reveals to us about how you engage with Tunisia. But this is Professor Masri in Tunis, takes a stroll in the original and still standing Medina, or city. And there you'll find evidence of a mix of cultures, eras and peoples. Founded in 698 CE as one of the first Arab Islamic towns in the Maghreb, the Medina was once counted amongst one of the wealthiest and greatest cities in the Arab world. A sojourn through the meandering alleyways of the Medina crosses fragrances that are a mixture of perfumes, spices and a history eloquently preserved. Like the old city of Jerusalem, that's not unimportant. It conjures up images of civilizations that have been through its gates and a sense of time that's become immortalized by structures that bear witness to the past, but are very much of the present. Now, I wonder if you could unpack this a little for us.
So, I mean, it's the what my research started uncovering. And I started by looking at the most recent history of Tunisia. So I already had a hypothesis when I started this research, and before I first went to Tunisia after the Arab Spring. And that is that Tunisia had always been known for having advanced the rights of women beyond where they are anywhere else in the Arab world. That a Tunisian education system was far better than education systems elsewhere in the region. And many had given tremendous amount of credit to Habib Bourguiba, the country's first president after independence in 1956 from the French. And my research and my delving into the story of Tunisia discovered, for example, that yes, Habib Bourguiba deserves a lot of credit, but that he did not appear in a vacuum, in a Tunisian vacuum, that there was a lot that facilitated the progress and the modernization that he brought to Tunisia after independence. And some of that is explained through the reform movement which had started in the middle of the 19th century. We can talk about that in more detail. So that, for example, his Code Statut Personnel, which advanced the rights of women beyond where they are today in any Arab country. Polygamy, for example, is today legal in every Arab country, except in Tunisia, and that has been the case since 1956. It turns out that there are others, As-Sanusi, Haddad, and Taalbi had done work early in the century while Tunisia was under French occupation that really facilitated things for Bourguiba. But then, there were factors that were much older than the 19th century that also, I think, facilitated the kind of progress that Bourguiba brought and facilitated the kind of environment that exists today in Tunisia. There is a civilizational history that I find, one, is celebrated and it's present there. You know, the moment that you land at the airport in Tunis, it's the Carthage-Tunis airport. You know, you go to the Medina and you immediately feel that you are in a time warp of sorts, but you see modernity there interacting with this antiquity that exists there. So that's really important. And then you find that that kind of civilization and history is not relegated to history books. It is part of how Tunisians identify as Tunisians, and it is part of what they learn in school. And it is not, there's no tension. So for example, you take Lebanon, and especially during and after the civil war in Lebanon, there's always the tension between the proponents of a Phoenician identity and an Arab identity. In Tunisia, I didn't get a sense that there was a tension between a Berber past, an Arab Muslim past, a Carthaginian past. I think that there is a continuity and an accumulation of those civilizations that have produced something that is uniquely Tunisian. So to me, you know, that sojourn, for example, in Medina, you know, brings all of these things together and reminds one of this rich history. And then later on in the book, as you saw, the Muslim past of Tunisia was also a very special and a very specific relationship with Tunisia. One of the chapters called Tunisian Islam, and a couple of my colleagues at Columbia said, you may not want to call it Tunisian Islam because that might set the stage for people to say, you know, it's different than, it's a different version of Islam. And to me, it's not a different version of Islam, but it's a different experience with Islam. The way that it has evolved in the Maghreb versus the East more broadly, but specifically in the case of Tunisia. So, you know, I use that just as an example of the kinds of things that I felt very aware of.
The subtitle of the book is an Arab Anomaly. Another subtitle could have been possibly a North African anomaly, because my relationship with Tunisia is very much through the relationship with France, Algeria and Morocco, the triangular colonial and post-colonial relationship. Is Tunisia different from its neighbours to the left? And if so, why and how?
Okay. So the short answer is yes. It is different from the countries to the left. And let's take Algeria, right? And you've written a book, you know, the French Intifada, really talks about the colonial experience in Algeria. So by the time the French arrived in Algeria in 1830 and annexed it to France, right? I mean, you know, Algeria was considered a part of France, and France fought for that until independence was granted in 1962. When the French arrived in Tunisia, they arrived throughout the 19th century, and they arrived because of economic interests as much as political interests. And the British were there, the Italians were there. By the time Tunisia became a protectorate of France in 1881, the experience and the history of Tunisia was a very different one. You already had a strong Tunisian identity. You had Tunisian borders that had existed really for centuries. I mean, you know, since Roman times, the boundaries of Tunisia, which at the time of the Romans really was the province of Africa with its capital as Carthage, did not change that much. The only other Arab country that one can say that is true about is Egypt, you know, with exceptions of the 19th century when Sudan was part of it and other times when it was not part of it. You had a history, you had a longevity of a geography and geographic boundaries, but more importantly, you had societal and economic dynamics that were in place. You know, you had trade that had been taking place with Europe. You had interaction among the Tunisian inhabitants of all different kinds of sects and classes and backgrounds and religions. And the relationship with the French was as such a very different kind of relationship that we witnessed elsewhere. There was a confidence that exuded, if you will, the Tunisian elites who formed the nationalist movement that fought against the French, but it was not a violent, it was not a military fight against the French. And it was a negotiated dance with the French, because of the history, and I think especially because of the reformist history and the level of education that had already existed in Tunisia. The resistance to the French did not equate with the rejection of everything colonial. So in between 1881 and 1956, while the French were there, it was fascinating to me to find out how much Tunisia benefited from some of the best that the French had to give it, particularly in the field of education. When you look at Habib Bourguiba and many of his compatriots, they led the nationalist movement. They were very much a product of the reform movement that had started in the middle of the 19th century in Tunisia. And when I say the reform movement, I mean the reform that resulted in abolitionism. The fact that Tunisia in 1846 abolished slavery, 2 years before we did in this country and 19 years before the United States did. In 1861, it adopted a constitution, the first for any Muslim or Arab country, the Security Covenant of 1857, which gave rights to non-Muslim citizens of Tunisia, in particular Jews and Christians who lived there. The introduction of secular education in 1875 in the form of the Sadiq College and so on. So to go back to Bourguiba and his compatriots were very much a product of that kind of environment. But they were also equally, if not more, a product of French colonialism in the best way possible, if you look at it from a modern perspective. So Bourguiba studied at Lycée Carnot, a French school in Tunis. He studied at Sadiq College, a Tunisian school in Tunis. He studied at Sorbonne over here. And he and others, wanted to blend sort of the best of the ideas and the systems that the French had to offer with everything that they had to offer. There was a confidence that stayed on, and after independence, Tunisia was very careful to preserve a special relationship with France, on which it depended for thought and for trade. And that continued to be the case until the present time. So to give you one example of that, which I found fascinating, the education system, of course, well, let me come back to this point. Let me go back to your question about Algeria, the Algeria that the French came into in 1830 was a very different landscape, right? There wasn't the kind of geographic boundary, there wasn't a historical existence the way that you had in Tunisia, you had Algeria, and you had different groups of people living in the country and so on. And the French were very brutal in Algeria, and Algeria had not evolved by that time. It was very difficult for it to evolve also under the French. The nationalist movement, by definition, was very anti-colonial, of course, and rightly so, and it rejected everything colonial. The post-independence experience is thus very, very different. So in Algeria, there was an understandable rejection of everything colonial. That anti-colonial sentiment also gave rise to Islamism, which became sort of a manifestation of that anti-colonialism. That then made its way into education systems immediately. So in Algeria, you had immediately a throwing away of everything that was French, everything that was colonial, including the language, including the education systems. So you had a new country. Its curriculum is mandated to be in Arabic. You didn't have any local teachers who were properly trained to teach. And you had to import thousands of teachers from places like Egypt, who were not the best teachers to come in, who would not understand the existing and local dialects and traditions, and whose dialect was impossible to understand by the locals. You had universal education that was introduced very, very quickly, and where religion made its way into the education system largely through Arabization. In Tunisia, what Bourguiba and his Minister of Education, Masri, fought very hard to do was to maintain French teachers while they trained Tunisian teachers. He insisted on bilingualism in the education system. So that to me was one, a very profound element in terms of how Tunisians evolved since independence, and to me it's a huge explanation of why Tunisians were better predisposed for democracy, because they were better educated, because they were educated in a bilingual system, because the amount of religion that they were taught and the kind of religion that they were taught in their schools was quite different. But at the same time, what you experienced in other places in that region were very, very different than that.
Is it fair to compare Bourguiba to someone else you mentioned in the book, Kemal Atatürk? For good or bad, would you go along with that comparison?
So yes, I think there is a lot of similarities between Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, and Bourguiba, the father of modern Tunisia. Again, the environments that they created their countries out of were quite different. So Atatürk, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the retrenchment of the Ottoman Empire into the modern geography of Turkey, and the rejection of the Ottoman past, especially the late past, and what it brought with it. So what Atatürk did, as you know, is he made a very conscious decision to turn Turkey west and north as opposed to south and east, away from the Arab world, away from the Muslim world, including in terms of customs and habits, but also in terms of the language and the alphabets. They were changed overnight. One night or one day, Turks went to bed. They woke up the next day illiterate because the alphabets had changed from the Arabic alphabet to the Latin alphabet. But that was symbolic of the direction that he wanted to take it. So Bourguiba, I think, dealt with things in a far more nuanced way. He didn't have to deal with many of the issues that Atatürk did. Both were very similar in that they both brought religion under the control of the state. So they each practiced the Jacobean model of laicite in their own way, however. In Atatürk's case, it was laicite so that religion could be abolished from the public scene. And it was abolished from the public scene. So the education system that Atatürk introduced did not include any instruction in religion. Bourguiba wanted to control religion, but he also, to his credit, presented himself as a mujtahid, as a person who is so knowledgeable about Islam that he spoke about the reform of the religion, and he spoke as a scholar. And he actually held his own with many Islamic scholars. And he ameliorated the role of religion in society. So, for example, rather than take it out of school curricula, he maintained up to 2 hours of religious education, 2 hours a week. And that continues to be the case in Tunisia. He did not abolish the hijab and did not abolish, Atatürk abolished the fez, for example, for men. But he spoke against it. He tried to appeal through his charisma, through his moral authority, such as when he famously drank a glass of orange juice on television during Ramadan. And he made the point that if we are going to fight poverty, how can we do that when we are fasting and we cannot be productive? So yes, there were some similarities, but there were also huge differences, both in the environments that they came into, but also in the approach that they took. I think, I mean, I don't know this, but I think that Bourguiba probably benefited from Ataturk's experience, and he was able to do things perhaps I think, in a more clever way.
This is two interrelated points. Arguably, it could be said that the model of laicité that Bourguiba takes is a French model. And this is a model that was introduced in France at the end of the 19th century, specifically to police the Catholic Church, as it were. So the first part of my question is, to what extent Bourguiba takes the French model and adapts it to local conditions, which leads me to a much more contemporary point that here in France and in North Africa, the concept laicité is the sworn enemy of Islamists and in Islamist discourse.
Right. Yes, and I would love to hear from you also about sort of where that is heading. And you and I have had conversations about this in the context of France. So what Bourguiba did is that he practiced laicité in a way that, as I said, made it acceptable by his countrymen. He was very smart to work from within the Muslim institution and to work with the religious authorities. In fact, his Code Procedural was based, it was really a codification into law of a treatise that had been written in 1930 by an Islamic scholar, Haddad, Our Women in Sharia and Society, في الشريعة والمجتمع, which argued for the same things that the Code Procedural offered. So one, in terms of the environment that we came into, Zaytuna, which is the place of Islamic scholarship as mosques, large mosques, tended to be historically in the Arab world. Zaytuna is sort of the Tunisian version of Al-Azhar, but it has very little to do with Al-Azhar, because Zaytuna was always a place of, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, a place of great scholarship and great debate. And you had the reformists within Zaytuna, and you have the traditionalists who fought with one another. But Bourguiba paid tribute to the religion, paid tribute to the religious authority. He mastermindedly got them to sanction all the changes that he introduced into the country. One. Two, while he was doing this, and while he was using Islam to sort of advance what he wanted to advance in the country, he swept the rug from under the religious authorities. So he annulled Muslim endowments, waqf, okay, which had grown in other countries, continued to grow to sort of fund activities that he was worried those would fund. So that's one example. He brought the judicial system into a centralized sort of controlled system, so that there was no independent religious judicial system. He closed down also the educational facilities associated with Zaytuna and integrated its faculty of theology into the University of Tunis, which he founded in 1961, 1962. So it was a very, delicate dance that he did with all of those things. And he was able to continue doing that in a way that was much smarter than what had been done elsewhere in the Arab region, where you had instead, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, an acquiescence by the state, oftentimes a state that is led by a secularist leader, to the Muslim Brotherhood and to Islamist movements. And what I argue is that the one area that was most vulnerable in those countries, and the one area that Islamist parties were always interested in, was education. And that's an area that Bourguiba protected, but that from Algeria to Morocco to Jordan to Egypt had been given control to the Islamists.
This is a big question, and we don't need to go into the great length and depth that it could occupy in a conversation, but it's important as well to think about how you see the journey from independence, Bourguiba, to Ben Ali, to revolution.
What do you mean? I mean, help me, because that's a very open-ended question, and I would take.
There's a big shift, isn't it, between Bourguiba's
I see. Okay.
and Ben Ali's not so much his vision, but his implementation,
Sure.
policies. And
Sure. So to take it even a step back in history, the tensions that exist in Tunisian society then still exist today between the secularist, sort of Mediterranean-oriented elites, if you will, and the more religious, more traditional forces. Now, they take on different shapes at different times, but they have always existed there. And those kinds of tensions, as is usually the case, the fault lines are also urban-rural. They're also economic, right? And so the coasts, and where Tunis, the capital, is, versus the interior of the country, which identifies more with its neighbors, Algeria and Libya, and where the borders are closer, and so on. But in the nationalist movement, and towards the end of it, before independence, the greatest tension was between Salah bin Yusuf and Habib Bourguiba. Salah bin Yusuf was an Arabist in his thinking. He was a pan-Arabist, pan-Islamist, influenced by the trends that were going on in Egypt, influenced by Jamal Abdel Nasser before Jamal Abdel Nasser came to be the powerful person that he became. Had Salah bin Yusuf won, Tunisia would be in a very different place today. Habib Bourguiba was decidedly Mediterranean in his orientation. He never rejected or turned his back on an Arab Muslim identity, but saw Tunisia as different. He always spoke about the specificity of Tunisia, right? He was charismatic. He had moral authority. He also abused his power considerably, and abused human rights, and was an authoritarian dictator. Right? One can say perhaps he was the benevolent dictator, if I want to perhaps over simplify it. Ben Ali came into power as a security man. Okay, Bourguiba again was cultured. He was well educated. He talks about the years that he spent in France as having really were formative years for him. The time that he spent at the Sorbonne. His first wife was French, who went back to Tunisia with him. Ben Ali, first of all, did not enjoy that kind of an educational, intellectual background. Ben Ali was a security man through and through, and spent some time in the army. He lacked the moral authority, the charisma that Bourguiba did. Trying to erase everything that was Bourguiba, and trying to erase the national narrative that was very Bourguibian, because he was very jealous of Bourguiba and of the following that Bourguiba had among Tunisians. And if you look at sort of that lack of confidence that he came in with, and I think he was a far less competent and less intelligent person than Bourguiba had, and then he was incredibly corrupt. Bourguiba died without a penny to his name. Ben Ali, by the time he fled, his family is said to have, at least based on documentation, embezzled about $13 billion of Tunisian money. They owned about 21%, measured per GDP, of businesses in Tunisia, and employed only 1% of Tunisians. I mean, the corruption, the kleptocracy was horrendous. An example also of the different approaches that they applied. And Ben Ali was, I think, far more draconian in terms of the measures that he took because of that lack of confidence and because of the environment that he dealt with. If you look at the role of religion and secularism in Tunisian society, under Ben Ali it was forced secularization, even though he probably was a far more religious person than Bourguiba was, and his family was quite pious, Ben Ali, that is. But Ben Ali, for example, went to extremes in terms of enforcing secularism and making it illegal to show or to wear religious symbols. Bourguiba never did that. He never had to do that, and he talked through these things. So it was a very different moment under Ben Ali, and our colleague Yusuf Sharif here has written about sort of the impact, the erasure of the nationalist history from Tunisian collective memory really went back to bite Tunisians after the revolution, because many did not feel a kind of affinity as they were growing up in the Tunisia of Ben Ali. And certainly it's a very different moment now. So I'll stop here because I know we'll talk more about contemporary Tunisia later on.
That's where I'm going to go, and I'm going to take you to a moment in our recent history. This is December 17th, 2010, when a young lad, vegetable seller in an obscure Tunisian town, sets fire to himself and seems to, in a couple of weeks, change the world. How do we explain? Because I was here in Paris, and I remember the Tunisian shops, the radios were blaring, the music was going, there was a feeling of festivity. But even Tunisians I spoke to, it was like, this is a miracle. We don't understand, but it's a miracle. Can we understand it now?
I think so. And I think, the one thing to me that was very, very important to understand is that that was an important moment, that was an important punctuation mark, that was an important trigger, but it didn't all start there, right? So, there was bent-up anguish among Tunisians. The revolution had started before then, actually. I mean, some would claim that in 2008, when you had the Gafsa riots, in the main mining town of Gafsa in Tunisia, there were riots. Those were clamped down upon by the Ben Ali regime quite violently. So things were brought under control, but it did not really settle among Tunisians. We didn't talk about civil society movement in Tunisia yet, but civil society personified in the labor union movement, L'Union Générale Tunisienne du Travail, which dates back to 1946. The labor union movement itself dates back to the 1920s, has always played a very, very important role in Tunisian society. It became very widespread through the country, had branch offices throughout the country, became grassroots. So even when Bourguiba and Ben Ali, who had ambivalent relationships with it, by the way, because at times they would try to control it and suppress it when it created problems for them, such as the protests of 1978 and 1985. But it also served a purpose for them. It served a purpose, one, in terms of a counterbalance to the Islamist movement that started in 1981, but also as an outlet for those who demanded some semblance of democracy in the country, right? So within UGTT, you can practice democracy, and actually I argue that the procedural democracy that Tunisians have been accustomed to within the confines of UGTT was part of the preparation that they had for a democratic process post the revolution. But UGTT, to go back, in 2008, considered that a missed opportunity, that the revolution could have started then and they could have ousted Ben Ali in 2008 had they had their act together then. So they kept that in their memory, and when Bouazizi self-immolated on December 7, 2010, UGTT immediately moved to the front and the center and helped organize protests. 2, social media played a huge role. 3, between 2008 and 2010, WikiLeaks, and then the Tunisian version of it, Tunis Leaks, started exposing the kleptocracy and the corruption of Ben Ali that everybody had suspected. Everybody knew that Ben Ali and his wife, Leila Trablsi, were incredibly corrupt. They were stealing the country. But when they saw evidence of that, when they were privy to telegrams between the French embassy, actually, yes, and the US embassy and their respective state departments, when they saw figures that spoke about the extent of the corruption, people were boiling. The economy also, we in the West also fared miserably. because we kept giving Ben Ali and Tunisia a passing grade. The IMF and the World Bank continued to give money to Ben Ali and to the country, which much of it was siphoned off. And we accepted numbers in economic indicators which, one, were manipulated, but two, were very misleading, because you had technocrats sitting in Washington looking at numbers that seemed to make sense, but who had no knowledge whatsoever of the huge discrepancy that existed within Tunisia geographically and economically. So, for example, while the unemployment rate at the national level was 15%, in the interior of the country it was 30%, double that. Okay, the poverty rate in the interior. So, we were, 30% of Tunisians were unemployed. The unemployment rate among the young and educated was incredibly high. So you had brewing sentiments. So when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, that resonated with Tunisians. It became about dignity. It became a rallying cry, helped by social media and helped by the role of civil society and the labor union movement to bring it to where it did. So it was an event that changed the course of history, but it was an event that had so much context and so much background and so much history associated with it.
One of the big points that I take from your book, and I think it's not so much a lesson as a starting point for wider discussion across the Arab world, is that we start to see that, and you can explain this better than I can, Tunisia is not a model for the rest of the Arab world, and there's a wave of exaltation after the Tunisian Spring, but actually, isn't there a great distinction between the Tunisian Spring and the Arab Spring?
What do you mean by that?
That Tunisia isn't necessarily a model for what happened in Egypt and in the Lebanon, because of the deep historic structures that you've revealed.
Absolutely. So, those who have argued, because we all want hope. We all want optimism. We want to believe that Tunisia became a source of pride for Arabs all over, and people were jealous of the Tunisian experience, right? And jealous in a positive way. They wanted to guard it, and they wanted it to be copied elsewhere. And I will admit that I was also, I followed that thinking until I really studied Tunisia, and I came out of that study concluding it cannot be a model, because the ingredients that allowed it to be where it is today have been in the making for a very, very, very long time. They didn't start with the Arab Spring or the Tunisian Spring. They didn't start even with Habib Bourguiba. Habib Bourguiba was a visionary person. He was a bold and ambitious person for his country, but he would not have been as successful had it not been for, and I'm just throw out a few names, Turkey and Tunisia, and Ahmed ibn Abi Diyaf, and Sadat Bey, and the institutions and the people and the movements that had been happening for 100 years. And if Tunisia did not have the specific geography and the specific civilizational history associated with it, it also benefited tremendously. One of the greatest, and it had also environmental factors, right? Geography being one of them. The other one is it did not have the resource burden of some of the other Arab countries. And it was a small country, detached, on the Mediterranean, North Africa. It wasn't important enough for the West or the East. It did not become entangled in the Cold War intrigues, and it wasn't important for the rest of the Arab world. Interestingly, now it is. Now Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Yusuf has recently written about this also, and Saudi Arabia are competing for influence in Tunisia, because the success of democracy in Tunisia is a huge threat to those regimes. So my argument in that it cannot serve as a model is because the ingredients present in Tunisia some of them are very specific to Tunisia, could never be replicated, and others that could be replicated, could provide inspiration, such as in the areas of reform, with regards to women's rights, education, religion and its role in society, and civil society at large. those not only had been developed over a very long period of time in Tunisia, while they were being developed, the reverse trends were taking place elsewhere in the region. And I can speak from personal experience about Jordan. You know, the Jordan I grew up in, as I mentioned earlier, the textbooks I studied then were nothing to write home about, but nonetheless, when I compare them to the textbooks that students today get exposed to, when I look at science textbooks for third graders, where every chapter is introduced by a religious verse and ends with a religious verse, when I look at the intolerance that is promulgated through textbooks in places like Saudi Arabia, and that's only one example. So my argument is Tunisia was moving in this direction with ups and downs, and certainly more downs than ups under Ben Ali, and I talk about sort of some of the threats that Tunisia is under. The rest of the Arab world was moving in a different trajectory. So it would take tremendous political will by the state and by the government, and it would take multiple generations for change to start taking place. So unfortunately, the hope I have for Tunisia is coupled with a sense of, and I hate that, despair for the rest of the Arab world.
Or isn't it realism as well? Despair?
Yeah.
This is my final question, and really I've got to throw it over to the audience as well. But the lesson I'm taking from your book, and this is a jumping off from everyone else, is that what I'm thinking of is that it reveals that the Arab world is not a monolith. In the same way that the post-1989 world revealed to us that the Eastern Bloc was not actually a bloc. And the two countries in transition move at very different speeds because of deep historical reasons towards democracy. Do you agree with that?
Totally. I mean, it's not a monolith. And so to go back to the question about the Arab Spring and the Tunisian Spring, the Arab Spring is a misnomer, not only because it really was only a spring in Tunisia, okay, but also because of the term Arab Spring, because that then paints the Arab world as if it were a monolith, as if it was something, like you said, the Eastern Bloc in 1989. And I do talk about issues of identity in the book, and I do talk about the fact that there's very little that connects beyond superficiality many countries of the Arab world. The shared history is a shared modern history, and the Pan-Arabism of al-Ba'ath Party and then of Jamal Abdel Nasser, that's all a very modern and a failed experiment at trying to create something that was pan-Arab. The shared history that is more ancient than that is a shared Muslim history which spread to the rest of that region. And there are huge differences in the genesis of the nations that we talk about in the Arab world, and certainly in terms of how they developed in the 20th century. So, one thing we did not have a chance to talk about is the foreign policy of Tunisia also. I mean, Bourguiba, one of the things I give him credit for is that in his foreign policy, he made sure that Tunisia did not get entangled in intra and inter-Arab intrigue in the way that other Arab countries did.
Can I throw this open? Yeah. Hello.
Professor Masri, bouncing off on what you had to say with regards to the evolving geopolitical position of Tunisia, what would you have to say about the pressures of the collapse of the Libyan state on what's going on and Tunisia's attempts to build something long-lasting in the wake of its spread?
Thank you. So that's a great question, and I hope you and I can share in answering those questions, because there are some things that I think you have a lot to say, and I'd love to hear your views on it, Andrew. The collapse of the Libyan state has also been, and again, I'm pointing to you because feel free to interject, has had an impact, of course, on Tunisia in many respects. The most obvious one is that Libya has served as a training ground for extremists from Tunisia. And usually, by the way, I launched the book about a month ago, and more often than not, the first question I get, so I'm going to ask it, well, maybe I shouldn't steal the thunder from anybody, So I leave it. But the question of extremism and the export of extremism from Tunisia, which is an anomaly in and of itself. So I'll wait until that question is asked and then I'll address that. But to me, Libya has been a training ground. The porous borders with Libya have allowed for people to enter Libyan territory and be trained at the hands of ISIS and other terrorist organizations. So I think the security threat has been very real in terms of the collapse of the Libyan state. The economy also in the interior of Tunisia has also been a factor in sort of the export of Tunisians into Libya and into Algeria to a very large extent, and the inflow of ideas, if you will, from both of those countries. So I think that the security threat is something that we're already feeling as a result of what's happening in Libya. I think that Tunisia has, since the terrorist attacks in Tunisia, the 3 big terrorist attacks at the Wadi Museum, Sousse Beach Resort, and Presidential Guard Bus, all took place in 2015. I think that Tunisia has been far more active at trying to control its borders, has been working with intelligence forces in Europe and elsewhere to try to manage the security situation in a much better way. Of course, broader than the security question, the geopolitical, what happens in Libya, what happens elsewhere in that region, of course, is a threat to Tunisia, and there are many factors associated with that are beyond the state's control.
Can I just maybe add to that? You're probably aware that today that there were calls in the House of Commons for the resignation of the British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson for a joke he made a week or so ago about Sirte, the ISIS headquarters in Libya, would be a new Dubai, only if only they could clear the dead bodies away. Now, what is truly sinister and disgraceful about that remark is to what extent a Western power is revealed as being deeply ignorant of a region where actually the two peoples, in terms of language and religion, are one, or at least part of the same family. There was a time when you could get a taxi from Tunis to Tripoli, believe it or not. And the borders are still porous culturally, linguistically, religiously. The real danger is that you have on the one hand a collapsed state which has been collapsing for a long time, which poses, first of all, a security issue, poses a whole series of geopolitical issues. And you have, Tunisia, which is trapped between that failed state and another monolith, which we haven't really talked about a great deal, whose road to transition is still very sluggish, and that's Algeria. So I think there are both local issues to do with the Tunisian relationship to Libya. And I saw this very visibly on recent trips to Tunisia, where I work with Tunisian journalists and representatives of people involved in civil society in Libya, and you can see that the two trajectories have been very, very different for such a long time that there's no way right now they're ever going to meet.
Thank you, Professor, for this very highly interesting talk. I have a question regarding this book. Maybe for whom have you written this book? For whom have you written
this book?
This book for Western countries to explain why they should have Tunisia, maybe. Not for other Arab, maybe for other Arab world, other countries in the Arab world, even if it's not the same model as you explained, or maybe for Tunisian also, so that they still believe in this revolution, despite all the all the difficulties that they're facing. And the last question is, with your knowledge today about Tunisia, what are the big threats surrounding this our country today?
Okay. So, thank you. The first question, I would say all of the above. I wrote it partially, to big part, to a Western audience, okay, to inform, perhaps educate to some extent about Tunisia and about the rest of the Arab world, to help counter what Andrew has just said about the ignorance that exists, by policymakers. So I wrote it to policymakers to some extent, to hopefully gain a better understanding of some of the dynamics in the Arab world and to bring attention to Tunisia. Because, the sad truth of the matter is that Jake Wales, who was the ambassador in Tunisia during the time I started doing the study, I saw him last week in Washington. I'll never forget when he told me how, when he goes back to Washington, the State Department, the White House under Obama, of course, really wanted to help and was so happy about what was happening in Tunisia. I actually heard that directly from Secretary Clinton earlier this year. But then that fails to translate into action. Why? Because they get distracted by the bigger problems in the region. They get distracted by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, by Iraq, by Syria. Okay. And I think we are living in a moment today. So it's really not only about Tunisia and the Arab world. We're living in a moment in the world today where democracy is under threat. The rise of illiberal democracy is threatening, right? The polarization that exists in the world today is, I think, unprecedented in modern history, one can say. We live in a very precarious moment in the world today, and I think it's important that we continue to examine the questions of the day from a global perspective. And in order to do so, it is as important to understand cases like Tunisia, as small as they are, and a democracy that is in the making, that is as important to me to understand as it is to understand Brexit or the Trump phenomenon, or what might be happening elsewhere. So that's a big part of my audience. Tunisians were not my target audience necessarily, but the reception in Tunisia has been really interesting. It's been very positive, and what I've been told by Tunisians are, first, thank you for the dose of optimism, because we tend to be very hard on ourselves and we tend to forget that what we have achieved is extraordinary. And thank you for reminding us of our history, of our rich history, because they hadn't really paid much attention. They took for granted some of the things that were taking place in the 19th century, which I argue really planted the seeds for what is happening today. Now, your second question, the threats that Tunisia are exposed to today, I think there are three. Security is one. We just talked about that, so I'm not going to repeat it, but that continues to be a threat. Two is the economy. Tunisia has started to show signs of improvement, and for the first time since the revolution, the GDP growth rate is going to exceed 2%. It's expected to hit 2.3%, for the remainder of this year and for next year. There is an anti-corruption campaign by the current government. I hope that the world is more sophisticated about how it looks at funding countries and stimulate economic growth. But the economy continues to be a threat. You still have large unemployment, you have a rising public debt in the country. And then the third is political stability. So yes, we have democratic institutions that are in place. You have an active civil society which continues to be very active, but the political stability has not yet been reached. And there are concerns within Tunisia about too much concentration of power in the hands of the president. Some excuse it and say this is a transitional phase and we need this. You have the passing of the reconciliation law, which gives amnesty to former Ben Ali public figures who were accused of corruption. That's very troubling. I find that to be a very troubling thing. At the same time, you have advances in terms of other laws. Women now in Tunisia can marry outside of their religion, and that's a first for an Arab country. And it's not presented as Muslim women can marry non-Muslims. It's about Tunisian citizens having equal rights when it comes to marriage, which is really a very fine and important difference. Now on the table is the issue of equality inheritance. Under Sharia law, a woman is entitled half of what a man is entitled to. Again, there are extenuating circumstances and so on. But gave a tried, and in 1973 he was told that's a red line, you cannot cross that. But he found other smart ways, by the way, to give women a greater share than they would have been entitled by Sharia. So now that's on some, I think, the skepticism surrounding those things, because some critics are saying, oh, these are moves meant to deflect attention from the passing of the reconciliation law. Maybe there is some truth in that. And Nahda, the former Islamist party, which has dropped Islamism from its label, its leader, Rashid Al-Nushi, is getting older. What's the future of Nahda post Rashid Al-Nushi? All of these things, I think, provide some stresses on a fragile democracy. Gentlemen there.
Thank you. I have a two-part question. The first one regarding Turkey, which you mentioned the experience of Ataturk. How worrying, in your assessment, do you see the recent turn of events with Erdogan after the coup d'etat and the huge purge that has been of academics and dissidents in the country? Is this a return to worse times for Turkey? And then for Egypt and for Algeria, which you mentioned a lot, Paul, which you talked about their own processes. What is the way forward? So they had the tribe revolution. It didn't work in sort of establishing the basis for the establishment of democracy. So governments in the West are trying to engage opposition movements or democratization leaders in both countries. What is the way forward? Who should they be engaging? And what sort of actions can help move the forces of democracy forward in those two countries?
Okay, thank you for those two great questions. So on Turkey, what's happening is very ominous, and it's very distressing what's been going on in Turkey, and I think it's going from bad to worse. It's on a trend that started a few years ago. And it continues, and the coup attempt has come in as sort of a very convenient excuse for purges. When you look at the number of journalists in Turkey who are in jail, when you look at the number of academics, one of our global centers is in Istanbul, and we face this on a day-to-day basis. We're facing it now with the visa situation, in that those have now been restricted. Americans cannot travel to Turkey, and Turks cannot travel to the United States. I think that what is most troubling for me about what's happening in Turkey also is what is happening to the education system. Because I argue from the prism of education that ultimately that's what really forms generations of people, and the impact of a good education can have a lasting positive effect, and the impact of poor education can destroy a country. And in Turkey, you have seen a slow but very conscious sort of seeping in of values that are not modern. Darwinism is not taught anymore. Parliament passed a law last year which dictated the teaching of kids as young as 3 and 4 year olds proper Muslim or Islamic values. Basically, AKP was unhappy that the concept of heaven and hell were not introduced to children in Turkey at an early enough age. The Imam Khatib schools, which are schools that were set up in the 1920s to train imams, to train teachers, right? It was part of the Legacy program, to bring control under the state of religion, have now grown to become all-purpose schools, and you have millions of Turkish students enrolled in them. So when the government needs to expand the schooling system, it only puts in Imam Khatib schools. And many schools have been closed down, and Imam Khatib schools have been brought in to replace them. So I think the situation in Turkey is very distressing. I think that To some extent, perhaps there is a backlash against too much forced secularization that had taken place and that had been also continued under the military, even when they were not in power. They were in power until the AKP came into being. I'll take from the second question, I'll comment on Egypt and let Andrew comment on Algeria. In Egypt, it's a military state, it's a deep police state, as it always has been. The problem in a place like Egypt is that you don't have political alternatives. You didn't have political alternatives. So before 2013, before the coup, when I would go to Egypt, I would meet with some of the people who had organized Tahrir Square, organized the revolution, organized protests, and so on. I was stunned by how unified they were in the negative space. They could all agree on what they did not want, but there was almost no agreement on what they wanted. They had no vision for the future. They had no practice with political parties. They had no practice with procedural democracy of any sort. And so the alternatives were from the get-go, from the day that Mubarak left office, were the military or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think what is needed in the case of Egypt, and what will take a very long time, is for that kind of political maturity to seep in. But I don't know how it's going to seep in with the kind of controls that are there. And with Saudi Arabia backing the military regime of Sisi, and now with the Trump administration also backing it, and even Obama blessed the Sisi regime. So Egypt, I think, will end for the long haul. I don't think that we will see anything. I mean, I think it is reminiscent perhaps of political dictatorships that came to rule in many Latin American countries and stayed in some cases for decades before there was a reaction. But again, I'll end this with the contextual note, and that is there is so much uncertainty about the region that no country is saved from what is going on around it. I think the old textbooks that explained the political centers of gravity and the political discourse about the region, those are all out the window. What used to be, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, where the centers of gravity were, that's no longer the case. It's today Riyadh and Doha. The Iran question, of course, is a very, very big question. The notion that strength came from large population, poor countries, in the cases of Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, that's no longer the case. Now it's the rentier states that are in power, and they're the ones who point to the shots.
I'll just say very briefly about Algeria that I make no recommendations, I prescribe no cure, but I can offer a kind of diagnosis of what I've seen in the past couple of years and what has changed and what has not changed. And what has changed is that in the past decade, in the words of a British security officer I spoke to not so long ago, they've stopped cracking heads. So there's a level of violence which is diminished, and that's got to be a good thing. However, it is clear to any outside eye and any inside eye that the Algerian state is paralysed and sclerotic, and there is no movement forward. It's where it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now, my view on Algeria, the second point I would make, is really the importance of its twisted and convoluted relationship with France, which is still very much alive. And I noticed that the Merah trial, which is taking place in Toulouse, one of the many foul acts of anti-Semitism that have been part of the latest wave in terrorism in France, has its roots somewhere deep in Algeria, Algerian history, the Algerian conflict with France, and the relationship, the triangular relationship between the Jews, the French, and Muslims in that relationship. This, to me, there's two things I would say about it. I was going to say this before. This is where the global becomes local. And my theory about Islamist thinking, jihadi thinking, is that it's out there and it's global and it's like the cloud. But what happens is when angry young men in various countries, whether they be Germany, Britain or France, download that ideology, it takes on local conditions. And the local conditions that it takes on in France is the poisoned territory of French history, the poisoned ground of French history, which is to begin in another chapter, which I'm not going to go into, the unfinished war between France and Algeria.
One more question?
What is your interpretation? The question for both of all these things.
Right.
Speaker, what's your interpretation when it comes to elections? Tunisians living in France, sometimes raised and educated in France, vote more for Islamist parties than in Tunisia itself.
I would pick that up with a follow-on from what I've just said before, that I'm not quite convinced that the colonial experience in Tunisia was altogether a happy one. There are levels of trauma which are less deep than the Algerian one, but I think the path towards radicalisation is often the same. It's to do with alienation, dispossession, but also as well an ideology which unpacks itself at a local level. And it explains, it's no accident to me that even white working class converts to Islam in the north of France were former communists, because Islamist theology, as it were, forms a totality which replaces all those earlier grand narratives, and it takes on conditions which are local, which explain exactly where you are politically. It's a false explanation, it's an illusion, it's a deadly illusion, but I think it goes some way to explaining how Tunisians on the other side of the Mediterranean might crave modernity, but those Tunisians in modernity don't understand that craving.
Right. So first of all, I would agree with that, and I would say, there are a couple of other factors having to do with Tunisians living here. One is what Andrew has talked about, what he's written about, is the marginalization, disenfranchisement of many of the African sort of minorities in France, with the Libanese and so on and so forth. Olivier Roy, for example, has written, I think, brilliantly about the radicalization that happens before Islamicization. So it has very little to do with Islam and with an understanding of Islam. It has more to do with economic and social factors that lead to radicalization of youth. Then the second point I want to raise over here is, over here you have, anywhere outside of the mother nation, there's an affinity that forms. So the Senegalese have an affinity with the Algerians, and the Tunisian identifies with the Moroccans. So I think there becomes sort of a blending because that affinity has strong roots in the common marginalization that many of them feel, but also a shared identity to some extent that brings them together. Now, on the notion of the modernity that's happening at place and radical ideas perhaps not having a home, so the question I always get, sometimes as the first question is, with Tunisia being so modern and being successful in the revolution and everything that you say, how can you explain that Tunisia has exported more fighters for ISIS than any other country? And I love getting that question because, it's an interesting question. First of all, what I want to say is that being in the number one position is always newsworthy. It gets the headline. But the difference between the numbers, when you talk about 5,000 from Tunisia or 4,500 from another country or 3,000 from another, those numbers are so small, relative also in absolute terms, and relative to their population, the population of ISIS, statistical, the difference is not statistically significant. So that's number one. But then you also have, in the case of Tunisia, tens of thousands of extremist thinkers, right, and Islamists who have been in exile or in prison, who were released into Tunisian society after the revolution. Many of them did not find a home for their ideas in Tunisia and looked for nationhood elsewhere. And ISIS offered an alternative form of nationhood. Now, of course, the Libya borders are a factor, and Nahda in power between 2011 and 2013, no control over preachers, what happens in mosques, are also other explanations. So many of, I think, many have left Tunisia because they did not find a welcoming environment for their ideas. So I think one more, Paul said, so I don't know. And you pick.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Farah, and I'm Tunisian. I came through the revolution, and I think there is one thing, maybe one element that has been forgotten, which is the Tunisian youth. And I wouldn't put it into civil society only, because I think we have had some kind of political maturity, even though we were in the blackout. At 16, we used to organize debates, even against our professors, and in secrecy. We would go out, we would debate, we would think about a better future. That thought made us go into the streets, and we didn't stop when violence became obvious. We didn't stop when Islamists took the power. We didn't stop when what we might consider as a go back to the agent regime retook the power. And we wouldn't stop from that. So I think that's one element that I don't know if it is forgotten, or the maturity of the Tunisian youth, and also kind of the stubbornness of that.
Yeah, not at all, it's not forgotten. And maybe, I love your comment because it is a reminder to be explicit about it. Because implicit in much of what I have said, both in terms of the education, in terms of the the role that social media had in mobilizing people. Who did it mobilize? It mobilized the youth. What I was saying also in terms of Egypt and the lack of political maturity, or the culture of debate and so on in Tunisia was very, very different. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book. The youth are also a very interesting thing in Tunisia, because even though they're the ones who organized, they're the ones who protested, after the revolution and then Ali was ousted, when they were unhappy with the transitional government and the fact that the remnants of the old regime were playing a role in government, they protested. And we had the Casbah protests round 1, then we had the Casbah protests round 2, until the government gave in. They insisted on constituent assembly elections, and they got them. In 2013, on the heels of political assassinations, we had the Bardo sit-ins. Those were all youth organizers, who were all youth executed. The sad part is that the youth, to a very large extent, were left behind. So when we talk about political stability, I think part of what needs to be accomplished in terms of political stability for this democracy to succeed and to continue is for a space for that youth to play a role in it. So what makes, when I mentioned the 3 threats on Tunisia's experience today, and I mentioned political stability, one of the threats is that the power brokers continue to be sort of the older generation. Many of them are also from the old regime. And the youth take to the streets, and in that they continue to be very, very effective. So you look at the reconciliation law, you look at Manish Masri, the grassroots protest movement. I say it with the Jordanian dialect. How would you say it in Tunisian dialect? Manish Masri. Okay, same thing. Manish Masri, I will not forgive. Meaning I am not willing to give amnesty to those who were corrupt in the Ben Ali regime. So the law gets passed, and as it gets passed, protests are taking place outside. They continue to take place, and I think that that's where the persistence comes. And you have also validated, so I argue that the factors that are not environmental, civil society, education, women, and religion, all of these things are interrelated. You learned as youth in Tunisia how to debate, right? You had to take 2 years of philosophy before you graduated from high school, right? I grew up in Jordan. I went to the best private school in Jordan. And everybody I know who went to the best private schools in Lebanon, in Egypt, everywhere else. What philosophy? We didn't study philosophy. We did not study philosophy. You studied religion. You studied evolutionism. you studied Darwinism. We had none of that, okay? So I think, you know, the role that education has played, and some of my Tunisian colleagues and I, when we discuss the fact that Tunisian education today is not what it was 20 or 30 years ago, but I say, but it's still pretty damn good, especially when you compare it to the rest of the Arab world. What I'm always impressed by is they always come back and retort with, well, we don't compare ourselves to the rest of the Arab world, we compare ourselves to the best European countries. Steve Coll, our colleague who's at the Vienna School of Journalism, he was there during the Casbah protests, writing a story for the New Yorker. He was also amazed when he talked to protesters about what model of democracy do you want to emulate. He thought they would say Indonesia, Malaysia, maybe Turkey, and they all said, they all used Western examples. That's because of the exposure that Tunisians had all along. So when Yusuf told me, you know, philosophy, it wasn't taught very well when I went to France to continue my studies, you know, I really understood the René Descartes much better. And I laughed so hard during that encounter because I said, you know, the rest of the Arab population, you know, went to college not even having heard of René Descartes, you know. So thank you for making that point. That's very, very important.
Thank you very, very much.